what if the harshest judgment you make about yourself, the deeply held belief that you are simply, lazy, is actually a complete biological and psychological misunderstanding?
I mean, it is a question that challenges the very foundation of how we evaluate human worth and, frankly, productivity as a whole.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving into a really rigorous psychological and behavioral analysis of motivation, fatigue, and misattribution. We are examining material that fundamentally challenges the cultural consensus on what it actually means when human beings just fail to act.
Right, and it's a deeply uncomfortable topic for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely, because it targets our sense of discipline. Now, my position today is that the concept of laziness is a scientifically imprecise misattribution. What we lazily call lazy is very often just a manifestation of cognitive overload and evolutionary energy regulation.
Yes. However, and this is crucial, I firmly maintain that we have to respect empirical boundaries here. A true lack of intrinsic motivation, a genuine preference for inaction over effort absolutely does exist. We cannot and really should not pathologize every single instance of someone simply not wanting to do the work by labeling it a, biological crisis.
Well, I come at it from a very different angle. My position is that what society so hastily and often quite cruelly labels as laziness is almost universally a manifestation of profound emotional exhaustion, burnout, and anxiety-driven avoidance.
Almost universally?
Almost universally. And this dynamic is massively exacerbated by a culture that weaponizes productivity against our fundamental biological limits. When we label systemic exhaustion as a character flaw, we do way more than just insult people. We actively destroy their capacity to recover. Because of the shame cycle, I assume.
Exactly. We trap them in this cycle of shame that drains the exact cognitive resources they need to initiate action in the first place.
Okay, let us start at the conceptual foundation of the material, which relies pretty heavily on a classic principle in cognitive psychology, the fundamental attribution error.
Right, a classic for a reason.
Yeah, it's the well-documented human tendency to observe a behavior, either in someone else or in ourselves, and immediately attribute it to an internal, stable character trait, while, completely ignoring the situational or systemic constraints acting upon that person.
You ignore the context entirely.
Precisely. So when an observer sees the behavior of not acting, they immediately conflate it with the intention of not wanting to act. They bypass the why and jump straight to the moral judgment.
And bringing this down to the human level reveals just how damaging that conflation really is. Because we don't just apply this error in a sterile, academic way to strangers on the street. We do it in the mirror.
Yeah, self-evaluation is usually the harshest.
Oh, it's brutal. Think about the last time you sat at your desk staring at a blank document, completely paralyzed. You wanted to write, you knew the deadline was looming, but you just couldn't make your hands move.
Sure, the classic writer's block scenario.
Right. But if you apply the fundamental attribution error in that exact moment, you take a situational constraint, like being wildly stressed or sleep-deprived or facing a highly ambiguous task, and you turn it into a brutal moral judgment.
You tell yourself, I am inadequate, I'm lazy.
Exactly. That assumption replaces any kind of genuine, curious inquiry about what is physically or emotionally blocking you. It replaces it with a narrative of harsh self-blame.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it a bit differently. I think it is not merely about the emotional damage of self-blame. It is about a fundamental misunderstanding of our own hardware.
What do you mean by hardware?
Well, think of the human brain as a hyper-conservative corporate accountant.
Okay.
From a strictly evolutionary perspective, the brain's primary overriding directive is energy management. It is constantly running a metabolic cost-benefit analysis behind the scenes.
Right, it wants to keep us alive.
Yes, exactly. So when you experience severe resistance to a task, when you just cannot seem to start, it is very often just that internal accountant signaling that the physiological and psychological cost of the action severely outweighs the expected reward. The ledger simply does not balance.
So the accountant is looking at the available resources and basically declaring a freeze on all non-essential spending.
Precisely. And this ties directly into the mechanics of cognitive load theory. Our working memory has a strictly finite capacity. It is not an endless repository where you can just dump information.
It's highly limited.
Highly limited. If you confront your cognitive system with excessive tasks or completely unclear priorities, working memory has to hold on to too many competing variables at once. It is a lot like opening, say, 100 resource-heavy tabs on your internet browser.
The computer's CPU doesn't just gradually slow down.
Right. It entirely freezes to prevent a system crash. That freeze is what happens to our executive functioning. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning and initiating action, just shuts down to protect the system.
To stop the overheating.
Yeah. From the outside, it looks like apathy, but operationally, it is processing paralysis.
And you know, that distinction between processing paralysis and apathy is just vital, because processing paralysis is actually highly active. Apathy is passive.
Right.
The cognitive machine is actually humming so hard that it is overheating, but the external observer just sees a machine that isn't moving forward. And that is exactly why it is so difficult to differentiate between laziness and exhaustion from a purely observational standpoint.
I see why you emphasize that. They do share the exact same symptom profile on the surface.
Outwardly, yes. But internally, the emotional landscape is completely different. And the critical differentiator here, which the material highlights, is the presence of the guilt gap.
The guilt gap. Unpack that a bit.
Yeah, so theoretical laziness implies a genuine, peaceful lack of desire to act. The truly lazy person thinks, I don't want to do this, and I am perfectly fine with that.
They're content in their inaction.
Exactly. But people who are exhausted or experiencing burnout, they desperately want to act. They care deeply about the outcome, yet they feel completely blocked. That gap between wanting to act and being physically unable to initiate the action breeds an immense amount of guilt.
It's an internal friction.
It is a painful, cyclical frustration. They berate themselves for their inaction, which ironically triggers a stress response that drains even more of the vital energy they need to actually start the task.
Okay, I hear what you are saying, and the guilt gap is definitely a compelling concept. But I have to push back hard here. I am not convinced by that line of reasoning when we look at specific, highly common behavioral patterns.
Like what?
Well, what about the person lying on the couch scrolling through short-form social media videos for 4 straight hours?
Okay.
From an observational standpoint, that looks exactly like laziness. They are clearly and consciously choosing a highly pleasurable, low-effort activity over a necessary, high-effort one. Where is the processing paralysis there?
Because that does not look like an overheated CPU to me. That looks like a direct preference for cheap leisure.
Look, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that interpretation at all.
Why not?
The data on screen time is staggering.
Because that framing completely ignores the neurobiology of depleted states. The source material refers to this specifically as reward-seeking behavior, and it is crucial we do not misread it as genuine leisure.
I think a lot of people would call a 4-hour TikTok binge leisure.
But it's not. When a person is lying on the couch scrolling for 4 hours, they usually aren't even having fun. It is not a restorative activity. It is a frantic, subconscious attempt at emotional regulation.
Oh, come on. Calling an hours-long social media binge self-medication borders on enabling, don't you think?
Not at all.
At what point does seeking dopamine become a convenient excuse for a simple lack of impulse control? We cannot just say the brain is acting on its own and the person is helpless.
It is not about removing agency. It is about understanding capacity. The depleted brain, the brain that has been running on the fumes of chronic stress, is desperately seeking low-barrier, high-reward stimuli just to cope with baseline fatigue.
So you're saying it's a desperate grab for fuel?
Yes. It is scraping the barrel for dopamine because dopamine is the currency of motivation. When the metabolic budget is functionally zero, your brain defaults to the only action it has the energy to execute. Moving your thumb on a screen requires almost zero cognitive load.
Right.
So it is not laziness. It is a self-medication strategy for a system that is fundamentally out of resources. You aren't choosing pleasure over necessity. You are choosing the only accessible stimulation available to a completely compromised nervous system.
Okay, let's say I grant you the mechanism there. The depleted brain defaulting to low-barrier dopamine hits because the executive function is offline.
Right.
What happens when the tank is full? The person is perfectly well rested, and they still avoid the task. That is not fatigue. That brings us to a deeper layer of task avoidance.
Well, in those cases, we are almost always looking at the anxiety component. Procrastination is so frequently rooted in anxiety, rather than a lack of care or intrinsic motivation.
How so?
When a task is tied to potential failure or evaluation by peers, or even just uncertainty about how to proceed, it activates threat-related neural pathways. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, lights up.
It treats the task like a threat.
Yes. The brain essentially perceives the blank spreadsheet or the difficult email to a boss as a physical predator. So inaction becomes a protective shield.
Fight, flight, or freeze.
Exactly. Freeze. It is a way to avoid immediate emotional discomfort, even though the person rationally knows it comes at a terrible long-term cost. The brain is prioritizing immediate psychological safety over long-term goals.
I see why you think that. And the amygdala response is real. But let me give you a different perspective. Because this is where the source material itself actually demands a critical counterpoint.
All right, go ahead.
We have to be extremely careful not to completely absolve all inaction by framing it as trauma or exhaustion or an amygdala threat response.
I'm not saying it's trauma. I'm just saying,
But the data clearly acknowledges that sometimes people genuinely lack intrinsic motivation. Sometimes a person is simply prioritizing short-term comfort over long-term growth. If we label every single instance of task avoidance as exhaustion or anxiety, we risk creating a framework where nobody is ever responsible for just doing the hard, uncomfortable work.
we risk pathologizing the very normal friction that is naturally required to achieve anything meaningful.
Look, that is a compelling argument, but have you considered that accountability and self-compassion aren't mutually exclusive?
I think they often are in practice.
But they shouldn't be. I accept your empirical boundary. Genuine misalignment of values does exist. Sometimes people really just do not want to do the work. But the text provides a brilliant mechanism to solve this exact tension without resorting to the blunt, frankly unhelpful instrument of calling someone lazy. Are you referring to the heuristic?
Yes, it introduces a diagnostic heuristic.
Right. The counterfactual question. It strips away the noise to find the root cause.
Exactly. It asks us to pose this specific scenario to ourselves. If all external pressures were removed and sufficient rest were achieved, would you feel motivated to re-engage with your goals?
Which is a highly illuminating thought experiment because it tests the validity of the depletion hypothesis.
Exactly the point. If you answer yes, if you say, look, if I just had a week to sleep and no manager breathing down my neck, I would actually love to finish that coding project or write that book, then your issue is definitively resource depletion. You are exhausted, not apathetic.
And if the answer is no?
To your point, if the answer is no, if you remove the pressure, restore the energy, and you still have absolutely no desire to engage with the task, that indicates a genuine misalignment of values. That is where your point about lacking intrinsic motivation holds true.
Right.
It still isn't laziness in the moral sense, but it is a massive signal that you are pursuing the wrong goal entirely.
Which makes accurate diagnosis the paramount issue here. Because if you treat a genuine misalignment of values with more sleep and self-care, you are still not going to want to do the work when you wake up.
No, you won't.
You are just going to be a well-rested person avoiding your job. Conversely, if you treat profound emotional and physical exhaustion with stricter discipline and rigid accountability, you are going to completely break the system.
And breaking the system is exactly what our modern societal norms implicitly encourage. We really have to confront the myth of constant productivity.
Hustle culture.
Yes, this hustle culture paradigm we operate within frames rest not as a biological necessity, but as a moral weakness. It literally equates human self-worth directly with measurable, continuous output.
I agree with that. It is an industrial-era manufacturing metric aggressively misapplied to modern cognitive labor. You cannot run a human brain like a factory assembly line.
You can't, and the tragedy of this paradigm is what happens internally to the individual. When a person's performance inevitably drops due to natural, biological, cognitive limits, they look at this pervasive cultural expectation and they internalize the failure.
They think it's their fault.
They think, I am not doing enough, therefore I am fundamentally not enough. So what do? They apply stricter discipline. They try to force it. And by attempting to force a depleted system to perform, they drastically accelerate their own burnout.
Right. And analytically speaking, self-regulation research has proven for decades that willpower and directed attention are highly finite resources. They physically deplete with use.
Exactly.
The traditional intervention that society preaches, effort maximization, which is essentially just telling people to try harder, is fundamentally illogical when you are dealing with a finite depleted resource.
It's absurd.
Telling an exhausted person to simply try harder is like shouting at an accountant to finalize the budget when the company's bank accounts have already been frozen. The funds simply aren't there.
So if effort maximization is the wrong approach, the necessary pivot is toward resource restoration.
Yes, and the material outlines that this requires a very structured intervention. It cannot just be vague advice to take it easy. Let's debate the hierarchy of these interventions, because I argue the physiological tier is the absolute only valid starting point.
I'm listening.
We are biological organisms before we are productivity machines. This means we're storing adequate sleep, proper nutrition, and baseline physical activity before anything else. Look at the biology of a sleep deficit.
It's devastating.
It is. When you are awake, a neurochemical called adenosine steadily builds up in your brain, physically binding to receptors and slowing down neural activity. That is what causes sleep pressure. You cannot outthink that chemical blockade with sheer willpower or, a new daily planner.
No?
The only way to clear the adenosine is to sleep. Without restoring that physiological baseline, any higher-order cognitive intervention is almost guaranteed to fail.
I completely validate the physiological foundation, but the intervention must urgently move to the second tier, which is cognitive structuring.
Okay.
Because even a well-rested brain will freeze if the task is poorly defined. This goes back to your accountant metaphor. If the brain is overwhelmed by ambiguity, we have to reduce the cognitive load.
How do you do that practically?
We do this through task decomposition, breaking a massive, terrifying project into ridiculously small, actionable steps. We have to change the environmental design so the brain doesn't have to spend precious executive function deciding how to start. You make the path of least resistance align directly with the necessary task.
I would add that prioritization is the linchpin there. The internal accountant needs to know exactly what the single most important action is. If everything is labeled high priority, the brain interprets that as an unresolvable conflict and defaults to doing nothing.
Everything becomes noise.
Right. But even if you optimize the cognitive load, we still have to confront the third tier, emotional awareness. This addresses the anxiety-driven avoidance you highlighted earlier.
Yes.
We have to identify the underlying emotional barriers. Are you afraid of failing? Are you afraid of being evaluated and found wanting by your peers?
And once you identify that specific fear, the research shows that you cannot just push it down, you have to use emotional labeling, literally naming the specific fear you are feeling.
Putting a word to it.
Right. Combining that with cognitive reappraisal, which really just means changing the story you are telling yourself about the task, actually dials down the brain's physiological panic response.
It lowers the amygdala activation.
It does. It turns the perceived predator back into just a difficult email. That emotional regulation is what finally allows you to re-engage with the task, not out of blind panic, but out of deliberate, conscious choice.
It is a systematic dismantling of the biological and psychological barriers to action. As we synthesize these perspectives today, I think the critical takeaway from my side of the table remains the absolute necessity of accurate diagnosis.
Okay.
We have to learn to distinguish between a systemic neurobiological imbalance, like cognitive overload, adenosine buildup, or burnout, and a genuine misalignment of goals. Prematurely labeling yourself as lazy obscures the data.
It certainly does.
It stops you from seeing whether you need a nap, a new workflow, or an entirely different career path. While I concede that burnout requires structural intervention, I still maintain that society is sometimes too quick to use depletion as a convenient shield against hard, uncomfortable work. We still need friction to grow. We have to maintain the empirical boundary that sometimes the goal itself is the problem, and changing it requires courage, not just rest.
I appreciate that tension, but my takeaway is that we must urgently shift our internal narrative before we can even begin to evaluate those goals.
You think that compassion has to come first?
It has to. We have to move away from this default setting of self-judgment and coercion. It is clearly, demonstrably not working. We are a deeply exhausted society running on the fumes of guilt.
Yeah.
When we reframe our inaction as a potential indicator of depletion rather than a moral deficiency, we open the door to genuine inquiry and compassion. We move from punishing ourselves to actually restoring our capacity.
There will always be a tension there, of course. Drawing that precise line, knowing exactly when you need to give yourself grace and take a step back, versus when you need to honestly, perhaps painfully, reevaluate your intrinsic motivations and push through the discomfort. That will always be a difficult, highly personal balancing act. There is no simple algorithm for the human experience.
No, there isn't. But we can start by asking profoundly better questions of ourselves. I think about it this way. The next time you find yourself staring at a screen, entirely unable to start a task, instead of immediately asking yourself why you are so inherently flawed or lazy, perhaps you should pause and ask, does my brain actually have the physical and emotional capacity in this exact moment to act?